And now, welcome remarks by Mr. Federico Sturzenegger, Governor, Central Bank of Argentina. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
A warm welcome to all of those who visit us from abroad. I know for many of you it has been a long trip, so we appreciate it very much that you're here. I'm going to continue in Spanish this introduction.
As I was telling everyone in Spanish, thank you so much for joining us. Many people are following us thanks to streaming here in English and Spanish, both streaming channels. Therefore, we are going to stick strictly to the agenda because there are many people outside there waiting for us to stick to the agenda. These money and banking seminars have been designed on a very simple concept as last year. This is a monetary policy meeting. We want to listen, to learn from many people who have learned from the challenges that we are facing right now at the Central Bank of Argentina. Yesterday, average inflation in countries is 3.5%, 3.3%, and average inflation, Governor Central Bank, or the rest of the governors of the central bank is only 3%, not 3.3%. Therefore, we have a group of people who are really working very well here, who are cognizant and familiar with these issues. We have organized this seminar in a sort of compact format. That is to say, this afternoon and tomorrow morning. The Central Bank of Argentina is working on three main axes: disinflation, which is the core axis; two, financial sector development; and three, eliminating cash. And the two goals, disinflation and developing the financial sectors, will be the core issues of this seminar. When we talk about disinflation, which started with this new government, we have four stages in place for disinflation. Phase one, the first 3 months, an initial correction, a process whereby we had to grapple with liabilities, which force us during those 3 months to absorb 25% of the monetary base. This was a first moment of correction and adjustment. After March last year, we focused our monetary policy on disinflation. Interest rate, policy monetary was nominal 28%. This is not basis point, of course, it's 28% nominal rate. And this caused rapid disinflation in the Argentine economy. In the second half of that year, average inflation 1.4%, monthly annual inflation around 18%. Therefore, this tight monetary policy, starting in March 2016, was compared against rapid and quick disinflation in the second half of the year. As inflation dropped, we started accommodating nominal rates consistently with the process of disinflation that we were anticipating, so there was a sort of relaxing and easing in the monetary policy of Argentina in the second half of the year 2016 up until February 2017. And this easing of the monetary policy was an ex-post excessive impact for Argentina, which made inflation grow in February, March April this year. When we noticed that dynamics in February this year, in March we started a new contractionary cycle in the monetary policy that has remained so far, and it has allowed us, after May, to engage in disinflation. Over the last 4 months, inflation in Argentina has been around 1.47%. Therefore, the central bank today has a monetary policy position which is contractionary. There's a game between interest rates and inflationary expectations, tight, hard monetary policy, and we are trying to have inflation by the end of this year around 1%, which adds to credibility to our 10% minus 2 inflation target for next year. Therefore, this implies that the group of people conducting monetary policy in the Central Bank of Argentina knows that the conditions today in our country are not mature for relaxation and or easing of our monetary policy the next months. Last year, when we were discussing these topics, reducing inflation would boost growth. Inflation today is as low as it has never been over the last 7 years. Average inflation over the last 4 months, 18.2%. Over the last 14 months, average inflation, 21% on an annual basis. And after the deceleration of inflation last year, disinflation, as we had anticipated, the Argentine economy started to grow. In the third quarter was an infant growth, but very vigorous indeed in the fourth quarter onwards. And this inflation goes hand in hand with recovery in economic growth. Reducing inflation has benefits on the supply as well as the demand side. On the first one, we increase confidence of investors, and reducing inflation reduces the inflationary tax, and the purchasing power increases, because when you reduce inflation, you are having equitable distribution in place. You are favoring the underserved, and because you are reducing the inflationary tax, and if you reduce inflation, credit is boosted as well. So you are helping demand on the credit side. On the other hand, is a supply shock, because the cost of capital is lower, which has been recorded in Argentina over the last year. The price system operates much better. The pass-through rate also drops, because you are measuring how the price system works, which was 0.8% between 2011 and 2015 over the last 15 months, and over the last month was 0.18. Therefore, part of what we are now dealing with will have to do with the disinflation and also with energy and dynamics in the Argentinian economy. The second pillar has to do with credit. When you have low inflation, you are boosting credit. Over the last years, average growth 20%, and over the last 4 years of this year, because inflation on an annual basis is 18%, credit is growing by 60% nominal rate, which is very important. Peso-denominated rates have dropped vis-à-vis 2015 values. Dollar-denominated rates have also dropped vis-à-vis 2015. Dramatic drop. Mortgage loans, of course, are very important, because if you don't have mortgage loans, the price is infinite and the rates are also infinite. And today in Argentina, people are having access to mortgage loans at the lowest rates ever recorded in Argentina. So this is a backdrop, and therefore we have organized these seminars basing ourselves on 3 pillars or sessions. The first session Let's see how the world is today. Argentina is in a process of integration and openness to the world. Second session connected with disinflation, and see the main challenges for Argentina in this process. And a third session or pillar for this afternoon that has to do with the challenges for growth in the financial sector, which over the last months have been accelerated, and it will continue in the forthcoming months and next years as well. Now, to see how the world looks like today, we are going to open up our afternoon session by inviting Dr. Ernesto Zedillo. As you can imagine, we are extremely honored to have him with us today. He has participated in globalization discussions all over the world, and he is one of the world referent people in this regard. Then we are going to invite Dr. Philip Lane, Governor, Central Bank of Ireland, and Dr. Martin Eichenbaum from Northwestern University. These people come from the academia, even though Philip is now in government, and they're going to give us the vision about global economy. Philip has been working on global imbalances for a very long time. He has an enlightening vision on that, and he's going to share with us his vision concerning Europe, and Martin will be focusing on the U.S. Then, the second panel session this afternoon will deal with the overall disinflation dynamics. We have three guest speakers that we are happy to welcome them. Carlos, Governor of the Central Bank of Paraguay. He earned the prize for the best central banker all over the world. An economy with only 3.2% inflation, and an economy average inflation 3.9%. We have a lot to learn from Carlos. And then we have the dean of all central bankers in Latin America. We learn a lot from Julio Velarde, Governor of the Central Bank of Peru for 11 years. Julio comes from an economy with only 3.2% inflation, annual rate, an average rate 5.1% over the last 5 years. And Carlos Beg, Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean, World Bank. He is an expert in, of course, disinflation, the exchange rate, Eastern Europe. He is absolutely familiar with all disinflationary processes in many parts of the world. So these are the open activities this afternoon, and then we're going to have dinner. We're very sorry because we don't have enough room for everyone, but those who have been invited are cordially wait here, because we're going to take you to the museum where Andrés Velasco is going to deal with economics, the first economy minister in the administration of Mrs. Bachelet. He's going to deal with these economic points. Remember that we are working along the lines of streaming. Please, tomorrow we are going to meet at 8:30 sharp. We're going to have three interesting panel sessions with disinflation and growth in the financial sectors. Marek Belka from Poland will be the first guest speaker. The financial sectors tripled in Poland. He was former governor of the National Bank of Poland, and then he was Prime Minister of Poland as well. And he is going to deal with the main challenges for Poland happened as the financial sector started to grow so quickly and rapidly, 3 times as much as it had been before. Erkan Kilimci, Deputy Governor, Central Bank of Turkey, he's going to share with us their experience. The size of the financial sectors was 5 times as big as it used to be before. And last but not least, Luis Linde, Governor of the Central Bank of Spain, where the financial sector doubled its own size, twice as big as it had been before. And he's going to share with us with different topics we should pay attention when we deal with disinflation and growth. And then Mrs. Carmen Reinhardt, who, of course, is a person known by you. She's a professor at the John Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University. She is going to speak about the relationship between disinflation and the financial sector. She's going to make a sort of very interesting summary concerning these 2 topics. And finally, we are going to close this seminar by an open-ended panel session with many central bankers that will be open to a Q&A session. And you will be able to ask everything you wanted to ask, and you never dared to do so. Therefore, let me introduce Ernesto to you. We are eager to listen to him. He needs no introduction. It is a sort of thank you. Ernesto was president between 1991 and 2001, president of Mexico. Ernesto was a person who brought life to Mexican democracy and political system. He created a different scenario. He made Mexico become a true democracy. But there is no transformation without crisis. And he was a leader who was able to succeed in achieving this goal. And therefore, this is the importance of his Secretary of Education, Secretary for Budget. He started his career at the Banco de Mexico, the Central Bank of Mexico, and this is the reason why he's here today with us. At this moment, he is a very important person in the field of globalization. He is in charge of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. And having said this, I will give you the floor, Ernesto. We have 45 minutes in all, 35 minutes presentation, 10 minutes Q&A session. Thank you so much, Ernesto.
Federico, when you sent me the program in English, I assumed that the conference would be in English. It's whatever language you want. I would have loved to be told that it would be in Spanish. I'd rather have it in Spanish. Anyhow, I prepared my words in English. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Of this conference. I thank Governor Sturzenegger and the new mayor for inviting me. As Federico mentioned, being part of this gathering makes me feel like going back to my roots as a central banker, although in a very different regional and global context from the one in which I lived when I was part of the Bank of Mexico's technical and management team several decades ago. I stopped being part of that team to become Undersecretary of the Budget on the Thursday right before the infamous Black Monday of October 19, 1987, 3 decades ago, and I promise I didn't have to do anything with the Black Monday. It says a lot about the passage of time and the change in the state of the world when this group comes to beautiful Buenos Aires to deliberate about disinflation and financial stability. Obviously, if this conference were taking place 30 years ago, the title instead would be, for sure, Inflation and Financial Stability. After all, inflation was the tip of the iceberg of many of the maladies that affected our Latin American region at the time, as it had been not long before also for some rich countries, including the United States. Of course, many other things in the economy and the politics of the world have changed dramatically over these 3 decades in ways that were totally unpredictable at the time. For one thing, little did we know that we were literally on the eve of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Little did we know, equally or even more importantly, that we were also on the eve of a dramatic acceleration of globalization, and with it, on a dramatic shift in the distribution of global economic power, with the rise of a number of developing economies, most remarkably China. We probably would have failed to envision that we were about to go through a great expansion in the use of global value chain by large manufacturers and retailers, involving the outsourcing of parts of the production process to firms located in different countries, an evolution that has had profound consequences on the international pattern of production and trade. Interestingly, Black Monday of October '87, as bad as it was, for example, for my own country, also proved to be a landmark for the beginning of the great moderation that seemed to be perpetual until the eruption of the subprime crisis 10 years ago, and more clearly with the collapse of Lehman Brothers a year later, event that delivered us the first great crisis of the 21st century, that very ably Carmen Reinhardt, I remember very well, warned us that would prove protracted. If we could have license today to say that the world was never the same after the Black Monday of 1987, it seems that we could submit also that the world has not and will not be the same after the other Black Monday, the one of September 15, 2008, when the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy happened. For one thing, not only did the great crisis cause a meaningful loss of output throughout the years of its acute phase, but also it is now clear the crisis brought about a negative effect on the trajectory of world output that has proved permanent. The discussion we have witnessed or be part of since Larry Summers' submission on secular stagnation, and I should say even the title of this conference, strongly suggests that indeed a secular dampening on global growth is part of our new normal. We are living through a period, one that probably will last a long time, of deflated or diminished expectations. It is evident that the conversation about the prospects for the developed economies, even in the presence of the relatively benign growth figures of 2017, is very different from the one we were entertaining a decade or so ago. The prudent caution on the part of the largest central banks to start firmly compressing their balance sheets despite a bubbly spirit in the markets is at least suggestive of their concerns about the new secular trend of lower growth. Needless to say, practically no economy has been spared from this post-Great Crisis new normal of deflated growth expectations. It is especially pertinent to stress this fact as we meet in one of the great cities of Latin America. Although we can now speak of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel in the largest economies of our region, it is only proper to admit how much dust we have beaten since some of our leaders, before, during, and after the crisis, made extravagant claims about what eventually proved to be a purely imaginary decoupling from the travails of the global economy. The commodity supercycle that more or less survived until 2014 was the opioid that caused those leaders to rest on their laurels and fail to recognize the illnesses that had infected our economies well before the crisis. The chief consequence of the Latin America complacency of a few years ago is that as the global economy gained enough momentum to leave behind the great crisis, the opposite happened in the region. This will be the fourth year in a row that we will have a rather lackluster economic performance, not only relative to other emerging regions, as has been the case for too long now, but also relative to its own immediate past. GDP growth, which had averaged close to 4% in the 10 years previous to 2014, will have averaged that year, between that year and 2017, only 0.4%. Needless to say, the biggest concern stemming from the region's lackluster performance is its effects on poverty reduction and income inequality. As reported by ECLA in its Social Panorama of Latin America, published in February, progress in reducing the average rates of poverty simply stopped in 2014 and actually could have backslid in 2015. There is now wide recognition in our region, albeit with some dramatically recalcitrant exceptions, that simply tuning up a few aspects of economic policy, as some pretended that was all that was needed to recover the growth of the go-go times, was never really a realistic and responsible option. Bolder adjustments, in fact, major shifts, have been warranted for a long time. Fortunately, but logically not without significant difficulties, this is happening, I insist, with some regrettable exceptions in Latin America. Unquestionably, unfortunately, Argentina is a most remarkable example where bold decisions have to be taken, and indeed have been taken by President Macri's government. And those decisions are beginning to deliver promising results, as was commented by the president of the bank. But neither here or anywhere else in Latin America are we betting that the lucky years of the first decade of the 21st century could make a comeback anytime soon. Of course, the deflation of expectations in the emerging economies goes well beyond the Latin American case. Those expectations are now also in a very different place from where they were previously in North and Sub-Saharan Africa a few years ago. The prospects of an African takeoff have now regressed into an African blues. For countries in the best performing emerging region, Asia, deflated expectations are also the rule, not the exception. This applies to the most successful large emerging economy, China, where long gone are the days of double-digit growth, and the question nowadays is how soon will annual growth fall below 6%. India wants to be the exception to deflated expectations, as proven by its growth record of the last 2 years, but the jury is out on whether this performance can be sustained at least in the absence of even bolder reforms, but admittedly, so far, so good. Although the list of factors suspected of contributing to the deflation of global growth expectations is not an insignificant one, not least as it includes the mystery of reduced growth productivity in advanced countries, particular consideration must be given to the question of whether globalization might have peaked already and could even be at risk of significant reversion. Naturally, most of the attention to the question of possible deglobalization has centered on trade. As you know, the global trade to GDP ratio grew from roughly 25% in 1960 to 60% in 2008. This happened because from 1960 to the eve of the crisis in 2007, global trade in goods and services grew at an average real rate of about 6% a year, which was about twice that of real GDP growth during the same period. After a sharp drop during the crisis and a brief rebound in its immediate aftermath, trade growth has been very weak relative to the past. In fact, it has not even keeping up with global output growth over several years. If this trend were to prevail, then the trade GDP ratio of 60% would prove to be a peak and would give credence to the presumption that globalization is stalling and even risks reversing. The confirmation of this presumption should be hugely concerning for those like myself who believe that the payoff of trade expansion has been, on balance, quite favorable not only for global growth on both developed and developing countries, but also, in particular, to increase average per capita income, reduce poverty rates, and accelerate human development in many, many developing countries. We get some relief about this concern from those who submit and support empirically the view that for the most part, the trade slowdown has been driven essentially by cyclical factors, such as the weakness in aggregate demand caused in turn by the necessary rebuilding of balance sheets, which has been certainly the case for several years in the Eurozone and more recently even in China and other emerging economies. There are also questions about whether the process of global integration may also be stalling by virtue of the process of financial deglobalization that has occurred over the last 10 years as cross-border capital flows decrease two-thirds, almost 65%. As in the case of trade, we are told that there is no cause of alarm since most of the contraction of international lending can be accounted by the global retrenchment of European and a few US banks, which, to respond to credit losses, had to cut enormously lending and other assets abroad. From this perspective, the observed financial globalization, far from being a broad phenomenon, reflects for the most part a cyclical deleveraging by itself a necessary and actually benign evolution. Be as it may be, but even analysis more supportive of the cyclical nature of the trade slowdown acknowledge that there might be other factors at play that should not be by any means overlooked. That non-cyclical structural factors help to explain the trade slowdown. This is suggested by the fact that the slowdown started before the crisis around the mid-2000s, in the middle of the first decade of the century. Among those factors, there are some that should not be worrisome as they reflect evolutions that should have been expected, such as the completion of the phase of fast integration of China and the Central and Eastern European economies into the global economy, a transition that by definition could not go on forever. Another one would be that the international fragmentation of production fostered by the development of supply chains has reached a plateau consistent with the existing information technologies and transportation technologies, circumstance that of course may change as these technologies continue to make sufficient progress in the years to come. But there are other non-cyclical circumstances that should be of true concern. One is, of course, that the multilateral efforts to further liberalize trade have failed terribly for many years, not least with the Doha Round, now totally defunct despite the multiple pledges made by the G20 in the aftermath of the crisis. They say that they will complete it successfully. Another is the increase in protectionism that rather quietly, in a murky way, avoiding still large-scale increases in the average level of border protection, has been taking place over several years, again, despite the solemn pledges of the G20. The failure of further multilateral liberalization and the occurrence of creeping protectionism are bad enough for the prospects of global growth. But a much worse scenario would emerge if, as a consequence of a policy misstep by a major economic power, a trade war could be triggered. Unfortunately, such a scenario, unthinkable until recently, should not be nowadays dismissed. The election of an old-fashioned nationalistic and populist government in the country that has championed and benefited the most from globalization is, in my view, the most significant downside risk faced by the world economy. Risk that I believe has been grossly overlooked until now by financial markets. It is not only about the threats made under the impulse of an electoral campaign, like the unilateral and arbitrary imposition of tariffs on targeted trade partners and dismissing outrightly the World Trade Organization's authority, but rather about concrete facts already materialized, like withdrawing for no good reason from the TPP and opening a renegotiation of NAFTA, what really raises my concern about the future of globalization and global growth. I find equally or even more concerning the use of nationalistic and populist postures at the expense of multilateral diplomacy in dealing with serious geopolitical issues, approach that conceivably could make more likely bellicose situations with dire consequences on the world economy. Being a Latin American may make me hypersensitive to the newly experienced northern non-tropical populism. But let me please claim in front of this distinguished audience that we Latin Americans, and certainly Argentinians, should know a thing or two about populism. In not just a few of our countries, including the big and the small, populism from both the left and the right, both democratic and undemocratic, has had a recurrent presence with consequences not exactly glorious. It is thus fit to recover from our memory some elements of the Latin American populist experience that could resonate with current events. Populists pursue popularity and power by making sweeping promises to deliver magical solutions to the very real problems of poverty, social exclusion, insecurity, and lack of economic opportunities effectively suffered by the population. Every populist practices political Manichaeism. In the populist discourse, every problem confronted by the country and its people only exists because the bad guys have been in charge. If the good ones are given the power, then problems will get solved just by virtue of goodwill. Undertaking persuasion by means not of reason, but of passion, prejudice, and ignorance is a frequent expedient of the typical Latin American populist. They all claim to be not only calling upon the people, but also, in fact, incarnating the people. However, for the populists, the people are regarded as only those who support or at least tolerate them. Consequently, those citizens who are neither active nor passive supporters are not acknowledged by the populists as being constituents of the people. Instead, they are considered enemies of the people. For this reason, populists feel entitled to insult, ridicule, and repress their opponents. In short, populists despise pluralism. In the name or the purported embodiment of the people, populists feel entitled to abuse power as soon as they have it. After all, whatever they do, they claim to do it on behalf and for the benefit of the people. They seize the state institutions, weaken them with the excuse of eliminating the barriers between the leader and the masses, and whatever is left of those institutions, populists use them as an instrument to keep and enhance their own power. In particular, populists set about at once, by legal or illegal means, to incapacitate precisely those institutions that exist to check and balance the executive branch. They go to the extreme of having their country's constitution changed or even fully replaced to enhance and extend their power, not least by allowing repeated re-election where it did not exist previously. Similarly, populists in power do anything within their legal and illegal capacity to stifle and, if possible, fully suppress civil society. The same attitude rules with respect to the free press, which from the outset, and as long as it survives, is considered to be political opposition. For populists, no opposition is legitimate, for only they themselves are supposed to speak on behalf of the people. Populist leaders are effective in making their supporters believe that they are part of something historically unique, like a profoundly transformative social revolution or a decisive resistance against foreign imperialism. It is thus not surprising that some Latin American populist leaders, even when democratically elected, have transformed themselves into autocrats or even worse, outright dictators. Populist leaders, even if cool-headed and rational at the beginning, end up being messianic and delusional as they gorge themselves with power. They would use every means at their disposal to foment their personality cult among the population. Patrimonialism, unfortunately a constant throughout the history of the political ethos of Latin America, becomes exacerbated under populist regimes. The patrimonialistic approach to using public resources facilitates corruption and, very importantly, serves to pay for clientelism. Populists pay for loyalty while severely punishing criticism and opposition. They use that loyalty to promote conflict against the democratic opposition and ardently pursue polarization in society. Populists make patent and profuse use of class conflict. It is interesting, however, that populist leaders' relationship with the so-called elite typically goes through a hate-love-hate cycle. Populists establish themselves in power by finding support from citizens with resentment, frustration, and anger towards the economic and political elite. Once in power, rather soon, the populist leaders, and at least some part of the elite, pursue mutual accommodation. For a while, the populist leader and the elite play with one another a useful idiot game, in which members of the elite bet on manipulating the populist leader by pampering his narcissist and messianic inclinations with a view to preserving, on balance, their own capture of the system. In turn, the populist leader likes to believe that he has achieved early surrender from the elite and sets about using this group to advance his agenda. The tacit mutual understanding between the populist leader and the elite lasts while the economy stays out of the trouble. When it goes south, the mutual acrimony and mistrust between the populist leader and the elite reemerges with great force. The full package of populism frequently includes anti-market economics, xenophobic and autarkic nationalism, and authoritarian politics. Populists have a marked tendency to blame others for their country's problems and failings, advancing and disseminating all kinds of conspiracy theories. They put the blame on fellow citizens who oppose the government, and with equal or more intense ardor on foreigners who invest in or export to their country. Restrictions, including draconian ones on trade and foreign investment, are an essential part of the populist toolkit. Populists praise isolationism and avoid international engagement, except with their foreign populist cronies. They are especially defensive towards international institutions and organizations by characterizing them as foreign aggressors trying to violate national sovereignty. Populists display their protectionism and xenophobia as proof of their authentic patriotism and excel at manipulating the public's nationalistic sentiments to execute their retrograde economic and political agenda. Cruelly but logically, populist governments, all of which promise to make their countries more independent from foreigners, end up making them more dependent and vulnerable to foreign powers. From the perspective of economic policy, fiscal and monetary profligacy is the most distinct characteristic of populists. The populist experiments to stimulate the economy and redistribute income with excessive fiscal deficits and command and control interventionist and protectionist policies have typically ended in economic catastrophe, where the poorest segments of the population have suffered the most devastating consequences. It is sound to state categorically that, as a rule, all populist governments and leaders have failed in Latin America. They might have had periods of apparent success, explained ironically mostly by favorable temporary international conditions, but practically invariably their economic and political stories have come to a tragically sad end. Making a proper recollection of this history, certainly more reflective and analytically than what I have done during these few minutes, is pertinent at least for two important reasons. First, we should wish that those toying nowadays with their own populist experiments be enlightened by our well-documented populist failures in Latin America. Let people know in faraway places what has happened to us when we have listened to the siren songs of demagogues. Second, and closer to our heart, we want to avoid a repetition, yet again, of history in our own quarters. Given the disappointing overall economic performance of the region over the last 4 years, along with the northern populist wave, should we be fearful of a revival of populism in Latin America? It is possible, but I would hope by no means certain. True, when the economy performs poorly and people's expectations for progress are negative, there is fertile ground for demagogues to try to win power, promising Manichaean, painless, and quick solutions for the population's afflictions. They also know that the aggressive rhetoric of northern populists in turn will make it easier to arouse nationalistic, xenophobic, and isolationist sentiments among Latin American populist-owned electorates. Nevertheless, I am confident that the risk of a populist resuscitation in Latin America will be significantly mitigated. I base my modest opinion on three sets of considerations. First, our electorates will not have to go far in history to visualize the fallacies and failures of populism in Latin America. The worst calamity caused by populism in a region is taking place as we speak. We are watching in real time the catastrophic economic, political, and social consequences of a populist revolution that has assiduously applied every single policy, artifice, and trick contained in the most comprehensive handbook of Latin American populism. It is practically unprecedented in modern world history that a country that for a number of years enjoyed immensely favorable external shock in the form of record high prices of its main export product, which translated into huge revenues, could over the same period become impoverished, have its physical and human capital decimated, become practically insolvent, and manage to become an archetype of political repression and destruction of democratic institutions. 2 minutes. Second, I thought that this beef was for Venezuela. I didn't want to say the name. Why did you? Second, mitigating the risk of a populist revival should also depend on the quality of the truly democratic alternatives for political leadership in our country. And let us hope that those alternatives are good. Thirdly, and I am hopeful that ironically, the newly reinvigorated northern non-tropical populism will also serve to inoculate us from a relapse into the Latin American populist disease. On the one hand, I trust that the northern populists will soon be fully discredited due to the flagrant inconsistencies bordering on absurdities of their purported policies and actions. On the other, I am very confident that the established checks and balances, admittedly much more solidly built than those in our Latin American systems, will not only limit the damage made by the non-tropical populists, but also will be capable of applying exemplary correctives to their deviant behaviors, correctives, and should serve to reinforce our own democratic convictions and practices. Let us feel sorry for our northern friends while we Latin Americans keep trying to do the right thing for our own development, never forgetting that international coordination, interdependence, cooperation, and solidarity are in our own national and regional interests. I sincerely wish that these values will be ardently and effectively promoted by the Argentinian government during its ongoing president of the G20. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. We have a 10-minute Q&A session, and while the mic can reach our participants, I will ask the first question. You mentioned secular stagnation. The world is entering a lackluster phase of growth. And I will test you to the limit as an economist or as a political scientist. Well, I will sit down. Do you know what despacito means? Slowly. I didn't know that, but one of my kids started to tell me what despacito is, the despacito dance. Despacito is a song and a dance that was seen 3.2 million times in YouTube. And this has an economic value. Somebody watched Despacito singing and dancing, and somebody saw the true consumption value. Do we have a measurement problem for global growth today in the world, where we are consuming a lot, but we don't have a market, we don't have a price, we don't have a stats? We have here the director of the Stats Institute of Argentina. Over lunch, we were discussing about artificial intelligence as well as a helper for this lackluster growth trend. Yes, there are many hypotheses to explain reduction in productivity growth and to determine whether we are now having a global and domestic GDP growth trend, which is very different from the one we used to have before. I have listened to many people, like Martin Feldstein, saying, yes, we are not measuring it correctly. Others say we are mismeasuring it because of the reasons you have just put forward, Federico. But so far, so good. If we don't have any other metrics at hand to make this assessment possible, these are the raw data that we have at hand, and we are working with those data in order to say that growth rates are much lower today than before. And if this is happening, we have to ask ourselves how people are behaving themselves from the political standpoint. We are living in a diminished expectation era or age relative to the years prior to the crisis. And this has been fertile ground for the revival and renaissance of populism. And this is an objective truth. We cannot deny it. Now, part of this process has to do with transition, a transition that has been caused by technological change, which has adversely affected many people all over the world, as well as many other people in developing areas. The technological change has a name: international trade, foreign trade. Politicians never talk about policies that they have not put in place in their countries if they have not been successful to enhance growth. They do not mention technological change because they are not familiar with it. So they are not savvy or cognizant of the details. And of course, if there are failures, they make the most of them to gain much more power. And they lay the blame on foreigners, foreign trade, for things that they should have really tackled with domestic policies. Banco in his book, Global Distribution of Income, speaks about technology opening and pot, P-O-T, and this is not marijuana or cannabis. This is what we have done or we have not done in order to make this transition much more fair and equitable. This transition that we are now living, rather than blaming globalization for everything, which is analytically unacceptable. And this is a way for politicians to evade their responsibilities. Now I am going to take a couple of questions, and we're going to read them out all, one after the other, and then please, Enrique, you answer them as a whole. Those questions are being asked without the mic. Okay. What about death of the Doha round today? You mentioned protectionism, so my question is the following. Are we witnessing a new bilateralism in international trade relations, as it happens with the revival of G2, the US and China, and the free trade agreement concerning the fact that we're going to have a new free trade agreement of the northern area with much more local or domestic components? My question has three pillars. One, are we witnessing a new bilateralism? Two, which is the outcome of this new free trade agreement? And three, what happens without this free trade agreement? Your country, Mexico, in your opinion, as a public policy maker, does Mexico has an opportunity to open up to other Latin American nations and negotiate new free trade agreements? Ernesto, if you agree, we can take some more questions and you can answer them. Oh, I hope that I will remember so many questions. At the back, please. My name is Beatriz Nofal, G20 Sherpa, up until July this year. You mentioned the G20 by the end of your presentation. You spoke about the general features of the global context. In your opinion, which should be the priorities for Argentina in the G20, 1 and 2? Argentina, as the Hamburg summit president had just said, Argentina has as a priority employment, digital agenda. Do you believe that these topics being included in the agenda, in the Argentinian agenda, and being the voice for Latin America is a much better way of addressing the problems of globalization in order to build initiatives and bridges to attain a better globalization rather than more globalization, a much more fair and equitable globalization? Thank you. My name is Juan José Cruces, University of Ditela University. You mentioned President Trump's policies. Ever since he took office, the American Stock Exchange increased by 20%. What is it that Wall Street is not familiar with? Bilateralism, free trade agreement, G20 agenda, and Trump. I hope that the alternative to this failure or lackluster outcome in order to build bilateralism would give rise to a modern regionalism, even though I love multilateralism. That avenue, that road, was an old-time pathway. It was the road that we had taken before in past years to sign bilateral agreements. Now we are facing major risks in this regard because the emphasis laid by the largest power is not based on regional agreements, building them, but rather destroying them. I mentioned that if a government, on the very first day of taking office, discards one of the best agreements ever signed to favor the interest of their own countries, and they say, I will get rid of that TPP. At the very beginning, I didn't like that TPP idea very much because Mexico did not have much to gain in the field of market access. But, of course, there were many non-commercial disciplines that were very difficult for Mexico to put in place in a very short time. But you know that I am a multilateralism supporter from the very beginning of my career. But once it was signed, we had to accept that there were opportunities. But I knew that that agreement was drafted according to the interest of the USA. So they took office, and the first thing that they did was to discard that. So they said, first of all, we are going to, of course, negotiate and then renegotiate the bilateral agreement in order to adjust and correct the balance of trade deficit between Mexico and the U.S. But the free trade agreement has no deficit. You know that because our experts come from what we trade under the principle of the most favored nation. So you cannot start negotiating something if the aim is fake or false, because the current account deficit is determined by a couple of macroeconomic factors. You cannot correct or adjust the trade policy. So if you're starting something on this idea, which is fake, garbage in, garbage out, has to do with the fact that negotiators will go the extra mile to obtain a result that won't be as destructive as it was. But this is a major cause for concern. At the Peterson Institute in Washington, I was holding a discussion a couple of months ago on this free trade agreement, and it seemed as if the Americans wanted to create a Mercosur alliance or partnership, and please bear with me. I'm not wanted to be offensive because I mentioned Mercosur, and some people said, well, why don't you organize a northern Mercosur? But so far, so good. Canadians have very good negotiators. Mexicans do have good negotiators. And Americans must find also good negotiators so as to have positive rather than destructive outcomes. As regards the G20, I think that a major mistake has been made when we wanted to enhance the G20 agenda, because the G20 was created to make decisions, to give financial stability to the world, to face much more positively all global imbalances. And it was established and created after the 2008 events at the level of leaders with three main commitments. Number one, coordinating macroeconomic policies. Two, strengthening financial institutions, international institutions, multilateral institutions. And three, in my opinion, we have been compliant only with three, enhancing coordination to determine supervision and surveillance of the financial system. In addition to this, there was a commitment to avoid protectionism and finalize the Doha round. And I think that this is a continuation of the policies, economic policies, but there has not been a serious reform, IMF, World Bank, and the only topic that was positive was financial regulation and supervision. So my piece of advice, such as I gave it to Mrs. Christine Lagarde, I told her, please do not allow President Sarkozy at that time to put a 50-item agenda in place, because you are going to lose focus and you won't be able to go forward, as it happened in the London summit in April 2009.
Subió 20% las
There was
acciones.
a 20% growth in shares. I said it in my words. I believe that markets are not acting in the most reasonable way yet. They have bet on a fiscal reform, tax reduction, and that has driven this craziness. I think it's a bubble that's going to blow. Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.